Hello and welcome to Roshango's Reviews, the show where I tell you my thoughts of the latest movies coming out in theaters near you, and ultimately, whether or not you should see them or not. I'm your host, Aaron Bolio, and welcome to another exciting episode of the show. If you're watching on public access, be sure to go online. Go to YouTube and look up the channel Roshango Media. There you can see all the episodes, and eventually I'm going to get on to some follow-up thoughts and some spoilers for the movies that I have done this show on, as well as maybe some other specials. You can also check us out on the Pararock TV Webcast Network, PTV. So, we'll get started with the show. This week I saw two very good movies that were very different. The first one I'm going to get to is an adult, I think, not quite independent movie, but it's definitely one of the lower sort of beginning productions. I'll get to what I mean by that in a minute. The second one is an animated children's movie, but I'll get started with the adult movie first. So, the first movie I saw is Dope, a movie that sparked my interest mainly because of how unknown a lot of the cast members are. When I looked up the cast for this movie, I actually didn't even see a profile picture on Flickster for the majority of the cast. As a matter of fact, only about 3 people had a result. And that usually can mean a good thing for a movie. Normally when it's a big production that they're trying to pile in, they'll get as many celebrities as possible, which isn't bad. But I always like it when you get to see these up-and-comers. You never know what you're going to expect, and a lot of times it's something different, and this is what this movie brought. It was different. Dope takes place in a very, very poor neighborhood in California. I think it's around Los Angeles. I can't quite remember the name of it, but the point being there is a lot of gangs, particularly the Bloods is a gang that you see primarily in this movie. But in the movie, it stars Malcolm. He and his 3 friends, or 2 friends, and they're in this. One of my favorite parts of the movie is their group. Malcolm, his best friend Jib, and his other best friend Diggy, who is a lesbian woman. They are in their senior year of high school, and they are complete nerds. They are obsessed with 90s hip-hop. They're obsessed with that culture. And they seem very out of date and out of time in the movie, and that's something that they make fun of a lot. And these 3 people could not be any more different from the rest of this town, which is primarily poor ghetto gang members. Now, Malcolm is trying to get into Harvard, and that's one of his biggest goals throughout this movie. But everything starts to take a big turn for their group when Malcolm meets this girl who is the ex-girlfriend of this drug dealer named Dom. The girl says that she really detests Dom at this point, but Dom wants her to go to his birthday party at this club. The girl basically tells Malcolm, "I'll go if you're going to go." And she displays an interest in Malcolm, mainly because she's trying to separate herself from the rest of this gang culture. She's trying to go to college herself, and she recognizes that Malcolm isn't like a lot of the other guys in this town. So Malcolm and the friends decide to break what they usually do on their Friday nights, which is their usual nerd things, and they go to this club. In the midst of it, the drug dealer gets a new shipment in the back room, and there's a humongous gang attack, and police officers come, and Dom, the gang member, has to get rid of the drugs quickly and shoves them in Malcolm's bag. Next thing we know, Malcolm and his friends are being hunted down by Bloods, and they end up bringing the drugs back to the main dealer, where they end up having to deal the drugs themselves if they want even a chance of making that out alive. And it becomes really curious as these 3 people who have absolutely no idea they've never taken these drugs before in their lives. I think 2 of them are virgins. They are the biggest dweebs ever, and just to see them get thrown from their comfort zone into dangerous drug territory. So what did I think of this movie? I found it really enjoyable, especially from a tone point of view, which is interesting because I just told you a very kind of dark story, but the style that they have makes it a really wacky movie, I guess for lack of a better term. watching these kids dress up as these 90s hip-hop people with these big colorful shirts and the ridiculous slang, and just seeing how they cope in these certain situations. And nothing is taken very seriously in this very serious movie, except for a few scenes. The wackiness kind of just carries through, and it makes the movie really funny, I'll be honest. And that's interesting because I don't think this was supposed to directly be a comedy, but I found it much funnier than I found Spy and Get Hard, two movies that I covered this year that were supposed to be comedies. I don't know, they really made the jokes work, especially with the concept of these nerds being out of their comfort zone, dealing drugs. The drugs they're dealing is a form of Molly, which is kind of interesting considering the fact that the movie's named Dope. But I think it's more referring to the slang term dope instead of the actual term for marijuana. Now, the wacky nature helps and hurts the movie in many different ways, though. The wackiness, as I said, does make it a really funny movie. At the same time, it takes a lot of serious scenes and reduces them down to jokes of sorts, but it's not exactly funny. Like, there's this one scene where you find out another nerd in the town died just by simply being in the wrong place in the wrong time. That's how bad of a neighborhood this is. And they almost treat it comedically from the way the narrator tells it and the music that they play. And when you actually watch it happen, it's really grisly, realistic blood. It didn't seem to be that funny. And it kind of ruined some very moody scenes. Now, something else interesting, another example of this that's interesting is later on in the movie when they are dealing the drugs, they're dealing it from their school using an online service that's basically a black market website, and that's how they're dealing the dope, or the Molly, I should say. They have the Molly in school, which is the interesting part, and they see a drug dog come in. And this is huge because if the drug dogs and the police find that they are serving these drugs, especially if they're coming from Malcolm's locker, then they're doomed. The jig is up. He could face jail time and he could lose his chance to get into Harvard, which is his ultimate goal in this movie, which is what makes the whole concept of selling drugs even more vital and even more important that they don't get caught. And they treat it like a wacky scene. He runs out of the classroom during SATs. He's practically slipping. He turns a corner, sees a cop, hides in the corner, and they treat it like, it almost felt like an episode of Scooby-Doo when they're hiding from the ghost, except it's police officers looking for his drug stash and could ruin his chance for a good future in this horrible gang-ridden town if they catch him. And it's just, sometimes that wacky mood kind of rubbed me off the wrong way on scenes like that. But something I found interesting is that this is a very intelligent movie, and it made me think about things long after watching it. Sometimes there were things that really bugged me in the movie because of how unrealistic it looked. But then when I thought about it, I actually started to like the choice. Like, for example, one of the ones I thought was really kind of dumb the first time I watched it was the nerdy kids walk through the X-ray machine, or the, not the X-ray machine, but the metal detector in their school, and they have a drug dog because this is a poor ghetto neighborhood and there's a lot of gang members in these schools, and that's why they're trying to make sure weapons and such aren't brought in here. And the reason why they're capable of dealing drugs in this school is because they have this big status of being the nerds, the good kids out of this whole gang, school full of gang members. So Malcolm walks through the metal detector and the dog starts barking, and the guard just assumes that the metal detector isn't working and the dog's just acting up for nothing because there's no way Malcolm, this big nerdy kid, could possibly be bringing anything dangerous into the school. At first I was like, come on, the guard isn't that dumb. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was kind of a social commentary. I kind of started to notice, yeah, it's true. We do judge things. And it's not just, it's kind of an interesting prejudice lesson that they try to teach there, because ordinarily when we see lessons like this, we see the opposite, which is something we do see, where the gang member's ex-girlfriend who invited Malcolm to the party, we assume that she's also wrapped up in this drug lifestyle. She has that persona, she has the look of someone that we assume would be there, but underneath we find out that she's clean and she's trying to get out of this situation, out of this town, and into a college for a bright future. And that's usually what we see. We see something negative that under the surface is positive. And we never actually see the opposite when it comes to prejudice. We never say, yep, that nerdy kid can't possibly be doing anything dangerous or illegal, because that's the prejudice we have. And it kind of made me start to think about how the way we judge things can be in all sorts of different ways. And it's really smart, and there's a lot of different undertones like that, and a lot of different scenes that originally I thought were dumb, but the more I thought about it and the more I thought about what they were trying to say with it, made me appreciate it more. Something that I think will definitely draw people into this, though, is Malcolm, Diggy, and Jib. They are a legitimate characters. All three of them, they don't feel like stereotypes. These aren't characters I've seen before. They're very fleshed out. You could just make a stereotypical Urkel nerd and just say that's your nerd for this movie, but they have different hobbies and interests. They're in a punk rock band together where they mix classic hip-hop with this modern-day funk, and they're very intelligent people, and they understand the culture they live in very deeply, despite the fact that they're trying to get out of it and deny it. They're very interesting people, and their friendship keeps you invested. They're fun people to watch, and they're great. And the other thing that's great is the pacing. Throughout this movie, I never looked at my phone or tried to figure out what time it was, and that's something I mentioned in previous reviews. You can usually tell how good a movie is if you're checking to see how long it is until it's over a lot. That's usually a bad sign, but I didn't check once watching this. It flowed very well. There wasn't any slower scenes that dragged the movie on. Everything that was even pointless, because there was some pointlessness in this movie, some scenes that went absolutely nowhere, they still were at least entertaining enough to keep you watching and keep you invested in seeing how the kids are going to get out of the situations that they are being basically thrown into and are completely unprepared for. Now, something I did find with that pointlessness, though, was one of the things that kind of disappointed me with this movie. We see many times that they try to highlight social media and modern day things, and they do it once and then kind of forget about it. And it felt like it had a lot to say, but it didn't spend the whole movie saying it. So, what's my final judgment? I'm giving Dope an 8 out of 10. It wasn't one of the more spectacular movies I've seen this year, but I found it really, really enjoyable. These characters were really enjoyable. Their friendship was really enjoyable. Their dilemma made it very interesting and gripping to watch. And despite some of the more pointless scenes, it ended up working really well in the end. My only fear is that this movie is going to date really badly. Mainly because we see how modern day is looking at these 90s kids, or these kids that love the 90s culture. And then I think maybe in 20 years we're going to be laughing at the people laughing at the 90s people. I'm just saying, it's very stuck in this time, and I have a lot of difficulty seeing it age well. But who knows? Maybe it will be seen as one of those classic wonders. Now, it is very, very inappropriate, so do not bring children. And if you're easily offended, they say the slang version of the N-word quite a bit, and they use a lot of foul language. There's a lot of basically that gangster culture. So very racy, very not for kids, but I think most adult audiences will find something to enjoy about it. Now, the second movie I saw was Inside Out, the latest Disney Pixar movie, and I'm so happy to see that Pixar is back. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, they haven't gone anywhere. It almost feels like they have. The last couple movies that Disney Pixar released were Monsters University, which didn't get a lot of critical praise, Brave, which was okay, but okay is almost like a sin for Disney and Pixar especially, and Cars 2, which everyone thought was horrible. So it really felt like Pixar was kind of losing its grip, especially because Disney was now releasing Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph and Big Hero 6 and these animated movies on their own without Pixar. And it almost felt like there wasn't a need for Pixar anymore, and Pixar kind of lost its way. But this movie gave me new hope for Pixar. All right, so what's this movie about? Inside Out takes a simplistic story and makes it more complicated by seeing the inner workings of it. Riley is an 11-year-old girl who lives with her mother and father, and they make a very wonderful family. But Riley and her family are going to be moving from their hometown in Minnesota to San Francisco, and the big move creates a lot of emotional shifts, emotions that we get to meet. Half the story takes place in the real world with kind of a simple story, but then what's happening in her head is where the movie's all about. Here is where we meet the emotions: joy, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. The 5 little people inside of Riley's head that make her who she is and control what she does, in a sense. The different ways she reacts, the different ways that these different people respond. Now, there is an issue that comes up later as we go along. The move is going really, really badly. It's just bad news after bad news. And Riley is usually a very happy person. And Joy, played by Amy Poehler, is usually right in command of everything. But on this day, everything's going really, really wrong. It seems like anger's acting up, fear's acting up a little bit, and sadness is really starting to act up. And just every bad thing that happens makes the day even worse, until a point happens where the core memories, which I'll get to later, get sucked into the long-term memory tube along with joy and sadness. And because of this, this makes Riley in a really, really bad mood, almost a depression of sorts. Now, what are the core memories? The core memories are these memories that Riley's had that define who she is, and they make up the most important parts of her personality in her head. And without those, Riley is not herself. And without joy and sadness, Riley cannot respond properly. She basically could only feel afraid and angry and disgusted. And this starts making her very negative, and things go from bad to worse. And so it's up to joy and sadness to find their way back up to the command center from the long-term memory in order to help save Riley. Now, as usual with these Pixar movies, the creativity was out there so much. It was like every little thought about what makes us who we are and what makes us think and tick and what goes on in our head, they decided to visualize. A train of thought is an actual train. They turn the memories into these different colored balls, and the balls glow depending on the color, or they glow in the color depending on the mood that Riley had when that memory was formed. You get to meet Riley's imaginary friend who's lost deep in her memory. You get to see the area where things get forgotten because not all the memories can stay. We get to see earworms and such things like that. Well, earworms to a degree, but still, it was amazing creative concepts. They created this entirely new world inside our heads. And what's so great about Pixar, and something they do so well, is if you're going to create a new world, you need to translate it to the audience. And Pixar has always been spectacular at doing this. In Toy Story, we learned almost everything we needed to know about the toy world just by watching it. We didn't need to ask too many questions because they answered them just when we needed to watch them, and that was the case with this. Now, it wasn't like they sat down and told us how it worked. They showed us how it worked, and that's what a great creative movie does, is when it creates these new concepts, it shows it to us. It's like when you were in school and you had a teacher. There's two different teachers you can have. You can have one that will lecture you, and yeah, sure, you might understand if they lecture you properly anyway, but you'll never actually enjoy it. You'll never actually find it interesting. And then there's the ones that teach by example and teach by display, and that's what this movie does. It teaches you everything you need to know by showing it to us and making us feel like we're there. Now, I'll start by saying this is also one of the funniest animated movies I've seen in years. I thought it was much funnier than Wreck-It Ralph was, and that was a few years ago. It was funnier than Frozen. It was funnier than Home and many other. I think Despicable Me. That's the level of humor we're at. We're high up there for these animated movies. It really feels like Pixar was Pixar again, and then the emotional moments mixed in with the comedy, mixed in with these stories, make it feel like it's up there with Up and Toy Story and all these really, really beloved Disney Pixar classics. And the humor is both visual and it's hilarious by uses of its voice actors, because their voice actors is an all-star cast and they do phenomenal. Especially the one I was looking most forward to, which is Lewis Black playing Anger. Almost every line he says is just so perfectly delivered in his way, and I couldn't think of better casting than the comedian of Lewis Black to play Anger. The humor alone is enough to see it. But it was also really deep in a way that a lot of kids' movies don't feel like they have to be, but this one decided to put the effort in because, you know, it's one thing to just have character development in a movie, which is essential, but this really took character development to the next level. It literally broke down, and it almost felt like the process of how Pixar creates characters. In Riley's head, the core memories each create these islands that define who she is. There's a memory of her goofing around, so there's an iconic part of her personality that says she's a goofball. There's an iconic part of her memory that says she loves playing hockey. There's a memory that makes it really important that she loves her family and she loves her friends and she's honest, and it's these separate islands that define who she is in terms of her memories, and that's how characters work. Experiences happen, and sometimes they change them and define who they are, and it felt really deep in that way. In a way I can't exactly explain, but the best way I can explain it is taking character development and breaking it down into individual pieces for the world to just see and look at it from its bare bones perspective. Now, if I had to nitpick, there were a few little questions I had that were a little confusing. I think the first was the emotions felt emotions, which was kind of weird. They kind of seem to display it as sadness is always sad and joy is always happy, etc., etc. But as the movie progresses and things happen to them, Joy starts feeling scared and angry and alone and sad, and the emotions start feeling different emotions. And it kind of starts to make you wonder how that works, but I gave it a pass and I said it's just a nitpick because it's going to be really hard to have joy and sadness be your two main characters when the only feelings that they can have are joy and sadness. The other thing I thought was kind of weird was sometimes it showed what was going on in other people's heads, and for some reason all the male characters had only male emotions. I guess you could say, like fear, anger, disgust, happy, joy. They were all men in the minds of a man. And in the mind of a woman, they were all female. Yet in Riley's head, disgust, sadness, and joy are female, and anger and fear are male. So it felt like maybe a few things slipped through the cracks of the script. But as I said before, it's just a nitpick. It really didn't affect anything. As a matter of fact, seeing what was going on inside of other people's heads are what made the comedy so great. And it worked in a lot of different ways. We got to see how Riley's dad's head was basically a war room, and anger was the one who was in charge. We got to see, and this is important, at the end of the movie, watch through the credits because they start showing all these random characters you met throughout the movie, and you get to see what's going on inside of their heads. And it is some of the funniest little shorts I have ever seen in an animated feature. And the story itself is really good as well, and it's fun watching development because Joy's purpose is to make sure Riley is always happy and satisfied with everything, and she feels like she has a purpose. Anger has to make sure that things are fair, and when things are not going Riley's way, that she can be assertive. Disgust to make sure that helps her avoid disgusting things and becoming socially acceptable. Fear warns her from danger. But the whole beginning of the movie, the question was, what is sadness there for? It seemed like sadness was only negative. And they kept treating her like she was just a negative emotion, and she only made things worse. And I felt really bad, and I really felt like Joy's ego about having to make Riley happy all the time and how sadness doesn't have a part in this head. It felt a little mean-spirited at first, but throughout the movie, you get to see their development as well, and you get to see sadness discover what she is important for and what she's there for. And it's really, really touching at the end of the movie when sadness discovers what she can be used for. And I'm going to be honest, I almost teared up. I was actually getting tears watching the end of this movie because it hit that hard. It was just another one of those really, really great Disney Pixar, just emotion-filled. It can be funny and dramatic, and it can touch you in all your different emotions, as the movie displayed all the different emotions. Kids are going to love it. Adults are going to love it. And if you were a fan growing up of Monsters, Inc. and Cars and Toy Story and Incredibles and all these other Disney Pixar, then definitely go see this movie. I'm giving it an 8.5 out of 10. It was one of the best Pixar movies up there. I'm gonna even go that far. I'm gonna say it's up there with Up and Toy Story, which are like basically the two pinnacles of masterpieces for Pixar. I'm not gonna say it was quite a masterpiece, but it was really good. And with that said, I'm Aaron Bolio, and I hope you all have a good weekend at the movies. Have a good night.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.